Hello, everyone. Today I am going to read to you the story titled The Seven League Boots by Christian Perrault. This story has been retold. There was once a woodcutter and his wife who had 7 children, all boys. The eldest was only 10 and the youngest only 7. Everyone was very surprised that they had so many children in such a short time, but it was because the wife had always borne twins except for the firstborn. The couple was very poor, and their 7 children were a great burden to them because none of them could yet earn his living. The youngest was extremely delicate and rarely said a word, which made them very unhappy. They thought he was stupid, but in fact he was really very clever. He was very small, and when he came into the world he was no bigger than a thumb, which was the reason why he was called Thumpkin. It seemed to the family that everything this poor child did or said was wrong. However, he was the finest and the most sensible of his brothers, and even though he talked very little, he listened a great deal. Then came a very difficult year, when the land was hit by a famine, and these poor people had to make the decision to get rid of their children. One evening, when the children were in bed, the woodcutter and his wife sat in front of the fire talking. He said to her, his heart broken with grief, "I cannot stand seeing our children starve in front of my eyes, so I have decided to lose them in the woods tomorrow. We will set them to gathering wood, and we will slip away without them seeing." "Ah!" cried the wife, "could you really be so cruel as to lose your children?" Her husband explained again how poor they were, but she could not consent to the plan. However, after considering what a great grief it would be to see them starve in front of her eyes, she finally agreed and went to bed in tears. Thumbkin had been listening to everything they said. He got up quietly and slid under the staircase to be able to hear them without being seen. He went back to bed but could not sleep for the rest of the night, for he was thinking about what he had to do. The next morning he got up very early and went to the bank of a stream, where he filled his pockets with little white stones. Then he returned home. When his family all left the house later, Thumbkin kept his secret to himself. Soon they were in a thick forest where it was impossible to see each other at a distance of 10 steps. The woodcutter started to work felling trees, while the children collected twigs and made bundles out of them. When their parents saw them working hard, they gradually moved away and then suddenly took off along a little footpath which returned home by a different route. When the children realized they were alone, they started to call for their parents and some began to cry. Thumbkin told them not to cry, for he knew very well how to get back to the house. As they had walked along, he had marked the path by dropping the little white stones from his pockets. "Do not be afraid, my brothers," he said. "Our father and mother have left us behind, but I will take you back home. Just follow me." They followed him, and he led them back to their home along the same path by which they went to the forest that morning. At first they were afraid to enter the house, and they put their ears to the door to hear what their father and mother were saying. Now, when the woodcutter and his wife had returned home, They found that the lord of the town had sent them 10 gold pieces. He had owed them the money for a long time, but they thought they would never get it back. This had given them new hope, for the poor couple were indeed starving. The woodcutter immediately sent his wife to the butcher's. Since she had not eaten for a long time, she bought 3 times as much meat than was needed to make supper for two. When they had eaten their fill, she said, "Oh dear! Where are our poor children now? They would have eaten a good meal tonight. I told you we would regret losing them. What are they doing now in that forest? Oh my goodness! Perhaps the wolves have eaten them already. You are so cruel to have abandoned your children like that." The woodcutter lost his patience as she went on, for he was really just as upset as his wife. However, he never liked a person to say, "I told you so," quite as often as she did. His wife was in tears now and crying, "Alas, where are my children now, my poor children?" She cried out so loudly that the children at the door heard her and started to shout all together, "We are here! We are here!" She rushed to open the door and welcomed them with open arms. "I am so happy to see you, my dear children!" she cried. "You must be very tired and hungry. And look how dirty you are. Peter, come here so I can wash your face." Peter was the eldest son, whom she loved the most because he was red-haired and took after his mother. Then they sat down at the table and ate with a healthy appetite, which pleased their father and mother. While they ate, they told their parents how frightened they had been in the forest, all talking at once most of the time. The woodcutter and his wife were delighted to have their children home again, but alas, their happiness lasted only as long as the 10 gold pieces did. When all the money was spent, they found themselves in the same desperate situation as before. They decided that they had no choice but to abandon their children again. This time, they planned to take them even further into the forest than the first time. Although the parents talked very quietly, Thumpkin again heard their plan. He thought that he would have no problem doing the same thing that he had done before, but when he got up early next morning to collect the stones, he found the door of the house locked. At first, Thumpkin didn't know what to do. However, their mother had given them each a piece of bread for breakfast, so he thought that he would be able to use this bread instead of stones. He would crumble the bread and drop the crumbs along the path, so he hid it in his pocket. Once again, the family set off. Their parents took the 7 boys to the thickest and darkest part of the forest, and soon after they arrived, their parents made an excuse to leave them behind. Thumbkin was not too worried because he thought he would find the way back easily, thanks to the bread he had scattered behind. But when he looked, he could not find a single crumb. The birds had eaten everyone. This time, the children were in a sorry state. The more they walked, the more they got lost and the deeper they went into the forest. Darkness came and a strong wind started to blow, which frightened them terribly. They thought they heard wolves howling and feared they would be attacked and eaten. They hardly dared to talk or move. Then it began to rain heavily and they were all soaked to the skin. They slipped at every step and fell into puddles, from which they scrambled up completely covered in mud. Thumpkin climbed a tree to see if he could discover something that could help them. Turning his head to look in all directions, he suddenly saw a tiny glimmer of light, like that of a candle, but it seemed to be far away beyond the forest. He slid down the tree, but when he reached the ground, he could no longer see anything at all. Nevertheless, after walking for quite a while with his brothers in the right direction, he suddenly saw the light again, and they came to the edge of the forest. Finally, they arrived at the house with a candlelight. They knocked at the door, and a woman opened it. Thumbkin told her that they were poor children who had got lost in the forest, and he asked her if they could spend the night there for nothing, as they had no money. Seeing how sad and handsome they all were, this woman started to cry, saying, "Alas, my poor children, where have you come to? Do you not know that this is the house of an ogre who eats little children?" "Oh, madam, what should we do?" gasped Thumbkin, who was trembling with fear as well as his brothers. "The wolves in the forest will eat us tonight if you do not give us shelter, and if we are to be eaten, we would rather it was by the master of this house than the wolves. Maybe he would feel sorry for us if you were willing to plead on our behalf." The ogre's wife thought she might be able to hide them from her husband until next morning, so she let them inside and took them to the fireplace to warm themselves. It was very hot, and there was a whole sheep roasting on the spit for the ogre's supper. Just when they began to feel warm, they heard 3 or 4 loud knocks at the door. The ogre had returned. The woman quickly hid the children under the bed and went to open the door. The first thing the ogre asked was if the supper was ready and if a bottle of wine had been opened, and immediately he sat down at the table. Suddenly he started sniffing to the left and the right and said that he smelled living flesh. "It must be the veal which I was preparing for you that you can smell," said his wife.
I tell you, I smell living flesh,"
exclaimed the ogre and gave his wife a suspicious look.
"There is something going on here, I think."
Having said this, he stood up from the table and went straight to bed. Then he realized what his sensitive nose had smelled.
"Ah, this is how you try to deceive me, you wretched woman!"
he shouted.
"I don't see why I shouldn't eat you as well, you old stupid woman. These rabbits will come in handy to entertain my ogre friends who are going to visit me."
One by one, he dragged the boys out from under the bed. The poor children fell on their knees and begged him for mercy, but they were in the hands of the cruelest ogre there ever was, who was already eating them in his imagination. He told his wife that the boys would make a tasty stew when cooked in a nice sauce. He picked up a huge knife and sharpened it on a long stone. Then he approached the frightened children. He had just grabbed one of them when his wife said, "Why do you want to do it at this hour? You've had a good supper. Why don't you do it tomorrow morning?"
"Be quiet!"
exclaimed the ogre.
"They will be more succulent now."
"But you still have so much meat here," said his wife. "Look, a calf, 2 sheep, and half a pig."
"You are right,"
agreed the ogre.
"Give them a good meal so they do not get thin, and put them to bed."
The kind woman was delighted and cooked the children a nice supper, but they were so terrified they could not eat a mouthful. As for the ogre, he was so delighted to have such a delicacy to offer his friends that he drank a dozen bottles of wine, which made him dizzy and he had to go to bed. Now, the ogre had 7 young daughters. The little ogresses were all very robust and had a ruddy complexions because they ate fresh meat like their father. But they had little round gray eyes, hooked noses, and huge mouths with long teeth, very sharp and very widely spaced. They were not yet as cruel as their father, but they were beginning to follow his footsteps, for they already liked to bite little children. They were sent to bed early, and all 7 of them slept in a large bed, each wearing a golden crown on their head. In the same room there was another bed of the same size. The ogre's wife put the 7 little boys in this bed, after which she went to bed herself beside her husband. Thumpkin was afraid that the ogre might regret not having cut their throats that evening and would wake up to do so before morning. He got up when he heard the ogre snoring and took off his brother's cap. Then he crept over to the ogre's 7 daughters, took off their crowns, and put the caps on their heads. He then returned to bed and put the crowns on his brother's head and his own. It was just as Thumbkin feared. The ogre woke up at midnight and regretted not butchering the lads the evening before, so he jumped out of bed and took up his huge knife.
Let us see how our little fools are doing,
He said to himself. Without lighting a candle, he groped his way upstairs in the dark to his daughter's room and approached the bed in which the little boys were sleeping. They were all fast asleep except for Thumbkin, who was very frightened when he felt the ogre's hand over his head. The ogre felt all the golden crowns.
Dear me,
He said.
this will never do. This is my daughter's bed. Ah, there they are,
He said.
our lovely lads. Let's do the job properly now.
Having said this, he cut the throats of his 7 daughters, thinking it was the boys. Then, happy at a job well done, he went back to bed. As soon as Thumbkin heard the ogre snoring again, he woke up his brothers. He told them to get dressed immediately and follow him. The boys crept quietly out of the house and climbed over the garden wall. They ran through the night, stumbling from fear and not knowing which way to go. When the ogre woke up next morning, he said to his wife,
Go upstairs and dress those little fools who came here yesterday.
His wife was very surprised at her husband's kindness, not suspecting for a minute that the way he meant her to dress them was as meat. But when she went upstairs, a terrible sight was awaiting her. She was horrified when she saw her 7 daughters with their throats cut and fainted at once, even though she was an ogress. The ogre wondered why his wife was taking such a long time doing the job he had ordered her to do. He too went upstairs, and was no less aghast than his wife when he saw the dreadful sight, although he did not faint.
Oh, what have I done? He cried. Those 7 rascals will pay for this, and right now.
First, he revived his wife, then he shouted,
Quickly, give me my 7 league boots, so that I can catch up with those scoundrels.
donning his magic boots that would travel 7 leagues in one stride, he searched throughout the land for the boys. After he had run a great distance in all directions, he finally came to the path where they were walking, no more than 100 steps from their father's house. To their horror, they saw the ogre stepping from mountain top to mountain top, crossing rivers as easily as if they were small streams. Thumbkin hid his brothers in a hollow rock nearby, and then hid himself, peeping out to watch the ogre. The ogre had become very weary from all his travels, despite the 7-league boots, which are incredibly tiring to wear. He wanted to rest, and by chance he sat down on the rock in which the boys were hiding. After sitting there for a while, he started to snore so frightfully that the poor children were just as scared as ever. Thumpkin told his brothers to run home as fast as they could while the ogre was sound asleep. They did as he said and arrived home almost immediately. Then Thumpkin crept up to the ogre, carefully removed the 7-league boots, and stepped into them himself. The boots were very long and wide, but as they were magic, they were able to grow larger or smaller to fit the person who is wearing them. So, when Thumbkin had them on, they fitted his legs and feet perfectly, as if they had been made for him. The little lad went straight back to the ogre's house, where he found his wife weeping over his 7 dead daughters. "Your husband is in great danger," said Thumbkin. "He has been captured by a gang of robbers who are threatening to kill him if he doesn't hand over all his gold and money. At the very moment they were holding the knife against his throat. He saw me and begged me to warn you of his plight. He said to tell you to give me his whole fortune without fail, otherwise they will kill him. Look, I have his 7-league boots, which proves all I say." Without hesitating for a second, the woman gave Thumbkin everything. Apart from his habit of eating little children, she loved the ogre, who was a very good husband to her. Loaded with all the ogre's treasure, Thumbkin returned to his father's house, where he was welcomed with great joy, and the family never went hungry again. And what happened to the ogre and his wife? Well, Thumbkin never saw either of them again, which is probably just as well. The end. This is the story about the 7-league boots.